Greetings, class. I hope you guys are doing well and staying safe. I have decided, originally I was going to schedule readings for chapter 3 and 4 from Gunfight this week, but to make things easier, I'm just going to do chapter 3. We just need to read chapter 3 for this week. And this video is all about chapter 3. I think the heart of chapter 3 is on page 73, where it talks about the Columbine shooters. And it's a pretty interesting story because I don't think a lot of people were aware of this. And I do think a lot of people are aware of the Columbine shooting. There's few people who aren't. However, I don't think people are that aware of how the shooters got their guns. And I think that how this happened is a great topic for a paper. So in the United States, we have gun shows where and I'm not knocking gun shows, but this chapter is a part of it, and I think this could be a big paper topic as well. So at gun shows, sometimes you can go to a gun show in some states and they don't require a background check. So anytime you buy a gun in the United States, in most states you're required to get a background check. But at gun shows, there's a loophole. It's called the gun show loophole. You could find a ton of research on it, but this is where the chapter centers. So what happened was the Columbine shooters, they were underage, so they could not purchase a gun. They couldn't purchase a gun. So what they decided to do is they decided to have their girlfriend buy a gun for them because the girlfriend was of age. She was 18 years old. She could buy the guns. Now, originally they were going to go to a gun store, but they decided not to because they figured it would be too big of a paper trail. So what they decided to do was they went to a gun show because at gun shows they don't do background checks. And so there'd be less paper trail. And it's very fascinating. On page 75, the girlfriend didn't end up buying the guns. It was Dylan Klebold who paid the cash and accepted the gun. And I think that's scary that somebody who is underage can go to a gun show and buy a gun and use that gun to kill 15 people. I think that's scary, and I think that's a very, very good topic for our paper. That, yes, we could do the gun shows, but you should still require them to do background checks and age checks. That should be a national requirement. I think that's a great topic. And I think page 74 had some pretty scary information. Like, for example, at the top of 74, it says 40% of all gun purchases occur through private sales at gun shows, at flea markets, through classified advertisements, or among friends with no background check. So I think if you ponder that for a second, we have 270 million guns in this country, and 40% of those guns have been purchased with no background check whatsoever. And I think that's frightening. And I think in the age of mental health and a lot of issues in our country, I think that we should have more background checks, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. Gun owners would agree with a lot of that as well. And also, in the next paragraph, it says, at gun shows, private sellers parade around with signs that say, gun for sale, no background check required. An investigation of gun shows in 3 states found that 63% of private sellers sold guns to purchasers who had told the sellers they probably couldn't pass a background check. So essentially, 63% of the people interviewed said they sold guns to somebody who couldn't pass a background check, which is pretty crazy. So that's like going up to a gun seller and saying, hey, I'm a felon. I'm not allowed to own a gun. I have a history of violence. I just got out of prison. And that's them saying, okay, here's a gun. And I think I think most people would agree that we should have background checks. They should be mandatory. And I think that's a very, very strong argument for a paper. I'm going to go through some other key points of this chapter. I'm probably going to split this video in half. But I think another key point, a lot of people wonder why the United States doesn't do more to stop gun violence or to make it harder to get guns. And a big answer for that is on page 46, where it says this. It says, I'm reading the top paragraph, where it says, during the 2000 race, the NRA spent millions on Bush's behalf, accounting for nearly $1 of $3 spent by outside groups on independent expenditures to help the Bush-Cheney ticket. So if you think about that, the NRA is very pro-gun. They're against gun laws. They basically gave George Bush 1/3 of his campaign money to run for president. And so I think that's an issue, is that lobbyists pay politicians off. So if you're president, and there's a shooting there's a shooting that riles the nation and makes everybody upset, you can't say, you know what, we should have gun control laws when essentially the NRA paid half your campaign. So it's very challenging. And I know it's easy to knock gun groups. I'm just trying to be a moderator, not give my opinion too much. But there's a lot of people who lobby for government. School unions lobby for government. Cigarette lobbyists have governed have tried to have philandered money and things like that through government. So as part of the problem is it's too easy to buy off the government in the United States, especially if you have a lot of money. And I think this really gets into it in this chapter. This is a very fascinating topic for me. And this whole paragraph this whole chapter summarizes this idea where it talks a lot about Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and and California has very strong gun regulations. We have stronger gun regulations than most of the states. And so what happened was he was governor of California, and he was pro-gun. However, you had the Black Panthers around his time. And the Black Panthers were a group of African Americans who were tired of police brutality. And I think this echoes a lot of what's going on today. But they were angry about police brutality. So what they did was they found state laws that said that they could march around with guns. And what they would do is they'd march around neighborhoods and protect them. And so if a police officer pulled them over, they would have guns, and they would ask the police officer, what is your probable cause? Why are you stopping this person? And so this created a lot of tension in the streets and a lot of escalation to the point where the Black Panthers marched in. They went to a Supreme Court, California Supreme Court case, and they had guns. And Ronald Reagan was looking at this, and he said, I don't think people should have guns in public places. I don't think they should have guns in court. So today, if you go to court, you go through metal detectors and things like that. So it was Ronald Reagan who actually passed a lot of the early gun legislation in our state, which is interesting, very interesting. And another thing to say, I think this is very, very important to say. This is the pro-gun argument I'm making. If you want to read chapter 8, it really gets into this topic, and that goes, America has always passed gun control laws to try to keep minorities from having guns to protect themselves. And that's an argument there as well. That carries on in chapter 8. But when Ronald Reagan became president, there was somebody he got shot. And the backstory of this, there was a shooter. His name is James Hinckley Jr. And this guy, he was obsessed with Jodie Foster. He loved her. She was an actress. She was in the movie Taxi Driver. She was in the movie Silence of the Lambs. Very famous actor. He was in love with her, and he wanted to impress her. So he figured out the best way to impress her, to get her attention, was to shoot the president, Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan was also the first president to run on the NRA's behalf. Took money from the NRA. They helped him get into power. And Ronald Reagan was shot, and one of his bodyguards, Bill Brady, was paralyzed. And it was a very fascinating moment in terms of gun control, because Ronald Reagan was like, I just took a lot of money from the NRA, but my good friend got shot. And I don't think I think we should have background checks to see if people have problems before they buy a gun. So it's interesting that Ronald Reagan, a very conservative president, actually passed some of the background legislation in our country. I find that very fascinating. And so you're talking about background checks, where they come from, what they're used for. Essentially, what they're used for is they're used to stopping. They do a criminal history to see if you've been involved in any crimes or something like that. And we're also pushing mental background checks, which I'm going to do in a separate video to cover the other half of this chapter, because it's a long chapter. So stay tuned.